In 1873, on the outskirts of New Orleans, the Delacroix mansion gleamed like a jewel of Creole grandeur, its wrought iron balconies entwined with wisteria, its halls echoing with music and laughter. Yet on one fateful night, the mansion became a stage for a tragedy that would render an entire lineage silent. The Delacroix family, proud and deeply rooted in tradition, gathered for their customary midnight meal, a ceremony of wealth, taste, and unspoken hierarchies. At the center of the evening was Lisette, a quiet kitchen maid whose hands moved with ritualistic precision, stirring a pot of soup whose aroma seemed to weave itself into the air like a living thing. Contemporaneous diaries describe the scent as hauntingly sweet, yet bitter with warning, as if the ingredients themselves whispered secrets long buried in the family's history. By dawn, the household lay dead. Faces were serene, eyes closed, meals untouched. Physicians could find no cause, no known poison, no signs of struggle. Priests murmured of divine judgment, while journalists speculated on revenge or long-hidden family feuds. Some historians proposed that Lisette, herself a descendant of families wronged by the Delacroix wealth and cruelty, might have enacted vengeance. Others insisted the night's horror was amplified by collective hysteria, a town's imagination seizing upon the quiet carnage to craft legend. Yet every theory faltered in the face of one unnerving fact: the air itself seemed altered. Witnesses recorded a lingering scent of herbs, salt, and something indefinably sorrowful that persisted long after the bodies were removed. Even decades later, descendants of nearby neighborhoods claim that during storms, the wind carries the faint memory of that midnight soup, an invisible echo of grief and guilt. Psychologists analyzing similar historical events in later years called it an intersection of trauma, obsession, and ritualized care, a deadly manifestation of grief transformed into action. Lisette, described by servants as soft-voiced and meticulous, may have internalized generations of injustice, turning her kitchen into a theater of retribution. Anthropologists note parallels with sacrificial feasts in other cultures, where food becomes a conduit for moral, spiritual, or psychological reckoning. Yet even these interpretations fail to reconcile the uncanny serenity of the dead, the inexplicable endurance of the soup's aroma, or the complete absence of motive clear enough to satisfy reason. This documentary delves into the layers of the Delacroix tragedy: history, psychology, superstition, and the haunting power of narrative itself. It examines the fragile line between victim and perpetrator, justice and obsession, memory and myth. By exploring witness accounts, diaries, contemporary press, and modern forensic interpretations, we seek to uncover not only what happened in that opulent Creole mansion, but why the story refuses to fade. Some see Lisette as a monster, others as an instrument of cosmic reckoning. Some argue it was chance, a convergence of factors beyond comprehension. Yet, all agree. The night of the midnight soup left a mark that transcends death, leaving an air thick with unresolved questions and the spectral taste of sorrow, herbs, and salt, a memory that lingers, unforgotten, in both place and imagination. The Delacroix mansion loomed over the streets of New Orleans' French Quarter like a sentinel of power, wealth, and the quiet decay that often follows both. Its walls, painted in muted creams and gilded accents, reflected candlelight that danced across marble floors, throwing long, flickering shadows into the corners of rooms where whispers thrived. From the outside, the house resembled perfection: balconies draped with ivy, fountains murmuring endlessly, and gardens arranged with painstaking symmetry. But anyone who lingered long enough in its halls, or listened too closely in the quiet moments of dusk, knew that perfection here was merely a facade. Inside, wealth and cruelty existed in a careful, almost ritualized balance, a duality as refined as the chandeliers overhead, yet as toxic as the air in the sealed kitchens where Lisette had spent her entire adolescence. The family's power, inherited across generations, rested not only on fortune but on secrecy, financial mismanagement hidden beneath public generosity, bitter rivalries disguised as polite disagreements, and an undercurrent of fear that ran like a river beneath the elegant surfaces. Every marble surface, every silver candlestick, carried the echoes of authority and resentment, and the mansion itself became a character in its own right, silent, observing, omniscient. Lisette, the kitchen maid whose hands would stir the fateful midnight soup, had been raised within these walls since childhood. Purchased at the age of 8, she was trained to move silently, to witness without comment, and to endure cruelty without acknowledgement. Her presence was both invisible and indelible. Guests often remarked on the strange quality of her gaze, the way she could appear in the periphery of a conversation, and yet leave a haunting impression that lingered long after she had retreated. Diaries kept by visiting relatives, business associates, and social elites contain repeated entries that hint at unease around her. The girl sings. "And I am chilled," one reads. Another notes, "Her hands move like water over the hearth, yet her eyes carry storms I cannot name." Lisette's voice, though soft and unassuming, could fill rooms with hymns, lullabies, or muttered phrases in a language none recognized. Scholars have debated whether these utterances were the remnants of a regional Creole dialect, fragments of African vernacular, or an intentional incantation designed to focus energy into the kitchen, into the meals she prepared, and perhaps unknowingly, into the fates of those who consumed them. By the time of the fatal supper, the Delacroix family was a household fractured by secrecy and tension. The patriarch, Éloi Delacroix, carried his debts like a shadow that grew longer with each passing day, his temper sharpened by the relentless pressure to maintain appearances. His wife, Geneviève, had grown bitter with age and disappointment, her attention oscillating between scolding Lisette for imagined mistakes and fawning over guests whose approval she sought desperately. The children, adolescents on the cusp of independence, were both terrified and enthralled by the undercurrents of menace that ran through their home. Each room, each corridor carried the weight of unspoken accusations, past grievances, and anticipatory dread. Guests described the atmosphere as one of tense elegance, as though every polite laugh concealed trembling bones beneath. Visitors would later claim that the air smelled faintly of rosemary and burnt sugar, an aroma that seemed out of place in rooms dominated by wealth, yet perfectly aligned with the unseen alchemy of the kitchen. The mansion, once a beacon of societal pride, now bore the hallmarks of psychological warfare waged quietly in the corners, under the guise of normalcy. Lisette's role within this ecosystem was paradoxical. Though she served at the lowest rung of the household hierarchy, her influence was subtle but absolute. Every dish she prepared, every herb she selected, every flick of the spoon seemed imbued with intention. Scholars analyzing her upbringing suggest that years of subjugation had cultivated a mind that understood the delicate mechanics of control. Small gestures became instruments of power. A bowl placed slightly off-center to unsettle a guest, a whispered phrase timed with the clatter of silverware, a pause that made a laugh hang uncomfortably in the air. Within the kitchen, Lisette was both servant and sovereign, a combination that allowed her to orchestrate a calm that could bend the atmosphere of the entire mansion. To the casual observer, she was invisible. To those attuned to the unspoken, she was the locus of tension, the axis upon which the household's psychology spun. Her actions, mundane to some, could have been interpreted as ritual to others, a performance where each motion contributed to the unseen choreography of fate. The preparation of the midnight soup itself became a focal point for the evening's tension. Recipes preserved in guest diaries describe a broth thick with herbs, rosemary, sage, thyme, and a careful layering of root vegetables that simmered with deliberate precision. Witnesses reported a scent that was simultaneously familiar and unsettling, the comfort of home, yet tinged with an indefinable bitterness. Lisette's stirring was described as mesmerizing, hypnotic, almost trance-like, a motion that drew attention yet invited speculation. Was this simple diligence or an act infused with intention beyond the culinary? The night's supper, framed by silver candelabras and heavy velvet drapes, contrasted the elegance of presentation with the undercurrent of dread. Historians debate whether Lisette's actions were premeditated vengeance, a ritualized offering, or the tragic result of a young mind conditioned by years of silent observation and suppressed trauma. Accounts of the evening's dinner suggest that the family's interactions were strained and brittle. Conversation flowed around Lisette's quiet presence, a tension-filled dance where every word was measured, every glance interpreted. Guests later recorded subtle disturbances, an inexplicable chill, the feeling of being observed from shadows, and the odd sense that the house itself was alive, breathing with intention. Contrasts abounded: opulence versus decay, civility versus cruelty, silence versus the potential for violence. Every silver dish reflected faces caught between comfort and anxiety, and the mansion's architecture seemed to amplify rather than diffuse unease. The dining room, with its polished mahogany and gilded mirrors, became a theater in which human emotions and the weight of inherited cruelty played out with a kind of terrible precision. Lizette's upbringing, scholars argue, created a psychological crucible. Decades of observation, subservience, and enforced invisibility may have developed in her a heightened awareness of human weakness. The mansion, with its echoes and shadows, was both classroom and confessional. Every secret witnessed, every whispered insult, every moment of fear absorbed silently into her mind, contributed to a cognitive map where influence could be exerted without detection. Whether she acted consciously or instinctively during the fatal supper is unknowable, but the pattern suggests that her decisions were informed by years of exposure to the household's latent malevolence. Ritual, timing, and the deliberate crafting of atmosphere became tools in her hands, tools whose consequences were not immediately understood but would reverberate through history. The architecture of the Delacroix mansion also played a role in the night's events. Long corridors with polished floors echoed footsteps, turning mundane movement into a symphony of tension. High windows allowed moonlight to spill across. Rooms at angles that highlighted dust motes like floating spirits. Kitchens were designed for both efficiency and observation, allowing a skilled cook like Lisette to maintain visual awareness of the household while performing intricate tasks. Halls, staircases, and hidden alcoves created opportunities for privacy, concealment, and the orchestration of events out of sight of others. In this environment, the mansion itself became an accomplice, a silent observer that enhanced the psychological drama of the evening. Historical records place the Delacroix family, Lisette, and the guests in their final configurations, noting seating arrangements, the flow of conversation, and the sequence of dishes served. Yet no record can fully convey the invisible tensions, the psychological undercurrents, or the potential intentions behind each gesture. Scholars continue to debate the line between fate, vengeance, ritual, and coincidence. Was Lisette a product of her environment, executing a silent revenge for years of oppression? Was she performing a ritual whose meaning has been lost to time? Or was she simply a witness to the culmination of familial decay, her hands moving mechanically while the mansion itself orchestrated the inevitable? The contrasts, uncertainties, and ambiguities ensure that the Delacroix mansion remains not just a physical location, but a living, breathing character in Thestery, a space where refinement and cruelty, silence and action, innocence and malevolence intersect in ways that defy resolution. By the end of that night, the mansion's gilded halls and fragrant kitchens had witnessed an act whose consequences would echo across generations. Lisette's role, whether as orchestrator, participant, or witness, became legend, whispered in the diaries of visitors and the hushed retellings of neighbors. The mansion, silent yet expressive, retained the memory of tension, preparation, and intent, forever a symbol of the interplay between human psychology, inherited cruelty, and the haunting power of place. Even today, scholars and folklorists study the space not merely as architecture, but as a crucible where refinement masks horror, and where one young servant's silent mastery of her environment could forever alter the course of a lineage. The Delacroix mansion thus stands as both stage and character, a monument to the perilous interplay of control, observation, and the invisible weight of history. By the stroke of midnight, the Delacroix family had gathered around the grand dining table, its polished mahogany gleaming under the soft flicker of hundreds of candle flames. The room, expansive and ornate, seemed to exhale the weight of history and expectation. Every gilded frame, every velvet-draped window, every mirror reflecting distorted images of the assembled guests amplified the tension that had been simmering for weeks. Outside, the air hung heavy with the scent of the Mississippi swamps, mingling with the faint aroma of wet moss, mud, and night-blooming jasmine that drifted through partially opened windows. Within the mansion, the tension was almost palpable, vibrating through the floorboards and the chandeliers above, brushing against the fine lace tablecloths and silver candlesticks as though the very air conspired to convey unease. The Delacroix children, pale and nervous, shifted in their chairs, their eyes flickering to the shadows at the corners of the room. Geneviève, the matriarch, wore her finest gown, yet even its rich fabric could not conceal the quiver of fear underlying her poised exterior. Eloi, the patriarch, sat rigid, his hands folded, his gaze fixed on the bowl of midnight soup before him. Every movement, every breath seemed to carry weight beyond the ordinary. Lisette emerged from the kitchen, her presence both unassuming and commanding. In her hands, she carried the soup, ladled with meticulous care into porcelain bowls etched with subtle floral patterns, their surfaces reflecting the candlelight like pools of liquid gold. The aroma of the soup was unlike anything contemporary witnesses could describe in words that would do it justice. Diaries preserved from guests describe it as simultaneously intoxicating and sorrowful, a fragrance that invoked memory, longing, and something almost ineffably mournful. Some accounts liken it to the smell of wet earth after a summer storm, mingled with the warmth of bread baking and herbs steeped in sunlight. Others insist it carried the faint trace of salt, as if tears had been added to the broth itself. Each guest inhaled the scent before tasting, and in that moment a silence settled over the room. A quiet so profound it was described in later testimonies as supernatural. It was not merely the absence of sound, but an oppressive presence, a pause in reality where the world seemed to tilt toward anticipation or dread, as though every diner felt the weight of events beyond comprehension pressing against the walls. The first spoonful was taken hesitantly, then another. The rhythm of eating became almost ceremonial, punctuated only by the clink of cutlery that would never again echo through the halls in ordinary conversation. Observers who later recounted the scene often focused on the strangeness of this ritualized silence. One visiting aunt wrote in her diary, "The soup is heaven and hell in a single taste, yet none speak, as if the lips know what the heart fears." Another recalled the way the candlelight flickered unevenly, casting shadows that stretched unnaturally across the walls, sometimes forming shapes that were fleeting yet distinct, elongated hands, faces appearing where none existed, the impression of movement in places untouched. Outside the mansion, neighbors reported seeing the light glow behind the drapes in rhythmic pulses, and a faint hum drifted through the streets, carried by the night wind like a dirge for the living. Some insisted it was Lisette's voice, her lullaby blending with the sighs of the bayou and the distant croak of frogs. Others claimed it was the mansion itself, resonating with latent energy, amplifying tension into sound. As the meal progressed, subtle anomalies were noted. Candles sputtered as though disturbed by an unseen hand. Windows, though closed, fogged inexplicably, and the mirrors reflected not only the diners but also shapes that vanished when observed directly. The texture of the soup was described in astonishing detail. It was thick, yet fluid, an amber-hued concoction with flecks of herbs and roots that seemed ordinary, yet each bite carried a peculiar lingering taste. Guests claimed it evoked memory, sadness, and an almost hypnotic state of awareness. Some later suggested that Lisette had whispered words over the pot while stirring, in tones inaudible to those beyond the kitchen doorway. Scholars analyzing these testimonies suggest that the combination of expectation, aroma, and psychological suggestion created a heightened state of perception, one that left the diners vulnerable to both external and internal forces, whether imagined or real. The timing, the atmosphere, and the meticulous preparation converged to produce a moment that was charged with intent, yet impossible to categorize with certainty. Within hours, every family member would be dead. Contemporaneous records indicate that the deaths were sudden, yet unnervingly calm. Faces, preserved in post-mortem sketches, are described as serene, almost beatific, contrasting sharply with the horror expected of violent death. There were no contortions of agony, no thrashing or claw marks, no sign that the body had resisted. Physicians of the time, called to examine the scene, could identify no conventional poison. No trace of arsenic, belladonna, or other known toxic compounds was found in the stomach contents. Clergy present claimed the event was divine judgment, a moral reckoning that exceeded human understanding. Skeptics argued for natural toxins, fungal contamination, or spontaneous chemical reactions within the soup. Modern toxicologists reviewing the sparse historical notes remain perplexed, noting that the combination of herbs, preparation techniques, and the absence of physiological markers defies classification by both 19th century and contemporary standards. Lisette herself vanished, never definitively accounted for. Later testimonies suggest she walked into the nearby bayou at dawn, her singing merging with the croak of frogs and the sigh of the Mississippi night. Some insist she was seen at the water's edge, barefoot and serene, her dress floating like mist across the reeds. Others claim she disappeared entirely, leaving only the faint scent of herbs and salt in the air. Her absence became as legendary as the deaths themselves, creating an almost mythological aura around her figure. The idea of Lisette as agent of fate, ritualistic performer, or unwitting instrument of calamity became central to retellings of the event, ensuring that every analysis blended fact, Folklore and speculation in equal measure. The aftermath of the supper extended beyond the family. The mansion remained untouched for days, the table set as if awaiting further consumption. Candles burned down, but the aroma lingered, a spectral presence noted by neighbors and later by investigators. Diaries, letters, and anecdotal reports collectively construct a narrative of an event that is simultaneously real and unreal. Some argue that the night represents premeditated action, a calculated response by Lisette to years of subjugation and observation. Others suggest a grotesque accident, amplified by the collective psyche of those present, a convergence of stress, fear, and the hypnotic influence of ritualized behavior. The boundaries between vengeance, spiritual ritual, and tragic happenstance blur in ways that defy resolution. Contemporary scholars, psychologists, and folklorists continue to debate the implications. Was the supper an act of revenge orchestrated by Lisette, informed by years of observation and suppressed trauma? Was it a ritual, invoking forces beyond human comprehension, rooted in Creole, African, or syncretic traditions? Or was it a convergence of human fragility, social tension, and environmental factors producing a fatal result entirely unintended? Each interpretation carries weight, yet none is conclusive. The fatal supper of the Delacroix mansion remains a locus of fascination because it resists categorization, dwelling in the liminal space between history and legend, psychology and superstition, observation and interpretation. The supper's legacy persists in the collective memory of New Orleans, and in the diaries, letters, and oral histories preserved across generations. The aroma of herbs, the haunting calm of the dead, and the vanishing of Lisette coalesce into a mythos that both seduces and terrifies. Scholars assert that the event exemplifies how narrative, memory, and psychological projection shape our understanding of history, blurring the line between what happened and what could have happened. The tension between observation and interpretation, fact and folklore, ensures that the Delacroix supper will never be fully understood, leaving the event suspended in perpetual mystery. Decades after the events at the Delacroix mansion, the story of the midnight soup persisted in both rumor and documentation, refusing to settle into the neat categories historians often desire. In the 1930s, with the rise of modern forensic science, investigators began to revisit the mansion and its artifacts. Kitchen tools, porcelain bowls, and fragments of utensils that had survived fires, floods, and decay were cataloged, stored in small glass cases, and subjected to tests unavailable to contemporaries. Early chemical analyses revealed traces of herbs now recognized as neuroactive, plants that could induce dizziness, mild paralysis, or hallucinations, but none could account fully for the serene, almost ethereal deaths of the Delacroix family. Ordinary toxicology explained only part of the mystery. The uniformity of effect, the unbroken calm on each face, the absence of physiological struggle remained inexplicable. Investigators puzzled. No combination of these botanical compounds known at the time could produce a lethality so precise, so controlled, without leaving evident marks or convulsions. This scientific perspective encountered limits, and in those limits, superstition crept, offering alternative frameworks to interpret the inexplicable. Spiritualists, drawn by tales of ritual, intent, and whispered incantations, converged upon the mansion's remnants with a different methodology. They examined the same bowls, the same stirring spoons, and the few remaining herbs as artifacts imbued with moral and spiritual significance. Their interpretations were steeped in Creole, African, and syncretic traditions, reflecting a worldview where objects could retain intentionality, where herbs were not mere chemical agents but conduits for ancestral power, channels through which spirits or energies might enact judgment. In their readings, Lisette's actions were more than human. They were ritualized performances that engaged with metaphysical forces, binding her victims' fates through both intent and object. Certain herbs identified in the chemical analyses were indeed used historically, in West African ceremonial contexts, for protection, for healing, and for curses. This confluence of botanical knowledge and ritual practice offered one explanation: that Lisette, intentionally or intuitively, wielded ancestral knowledge in a way that interacted with the material world, creating outcomes that were as psychologically potent as they were physically inexplicable. Psychologists in the mid-20th century, observing both the historical record and contemporary reports, introduced yet another layer of interpretation. They suggested that guilt, repression, and trauma might converge in what is now called mass psychosomatic or psychogenic death phenomena. Lisette, raised in secrecy, subjugation, and observation of the Delacroix family's cruelty, may have developed extraordinary awareness of human behavior, allowing her to manipulate perception subtly. The victims, conditioned by fear, inherited expectations, and social tension, might have experienced psychosomatic collapse under the influence of suggestion, aroma, and ritualized presentation. In this interpretation, the herb's chemical properties were secondary, catalysts to a psychological event that could not be measured solely by laboratory standards. The psychological lens framed the fatal supper as an intersection between environmental stimuli and human cognition, where the mansion, the soup, and Lisette's behavior collectively orchestrated a cascade of human response beyond ordinary causality. Yet even this explanation falters when confronted with the singular serenity of the deaths, suggesting that psychological and chemical theories alone cannot account for the totality of the event. Contrasts dominate every analysis: reason against faith, empiricism against superstition, science against story. Each new generation of scholars, chemists, and folklorists attempted to categorize the event according to the tools of their discipline, yet none could claim completeness. One historian summarized this duality: the mansion offers either a lesson in human psychology or a demonstration of ancestral power. Both interpretations are compelling, and both remain incomplete. The cultural memory of the town, its recorded oral histories, and the continuous retelling of Lisette's actions preserve this ambiguity. Local narrators speak of the smell of herbs carried by wind through the now dilapidated mansion, of faint traces of incantations in the air, and of the impression that the house itself remembers. Scientific observation can confirm the presence of certain chemical compounds, yet it cannot detect intent, ritual, or cultural resonance. Spiritual interpretation acknowledges intent, ritual, and ancestral connection but cannot measure toxicity or rule out natural causation. Both approaches meet resistance when forced to account for the phenomenon in totality. Modern forensic studies added more complexity. In the 1970s, soil samples from around the kitchen and bayou were analyzed, revealing unidentifiable mineral traces, residues that resisted classification by any laboratory standard at the time. Some of these compounds resembled salts produced in ceremonial contexts. Others were inert, but appeared to have been combined in ways inconsistent with natural deposition. Spectrographic analysis of remaining fragments of Lisette's bowls identified residues of organic compounds that were stable over decades, suggesting that the soup, or elements of it, contained ingredients intentionally prepared for longevity, perhaps as part of a ritualistic method. These findings blurred boundaries further. Was the chemistry deliberate, coincidental, or the result of an interaction between plant compounds and water sources unique to that region? No consensus emerged, only deeper fascination and renewed speculation. In parallel, the spiritual narrative continued to evolve. Lisette's supposed rituals, recorded in fragments of diaries, local lore, and second-hand testimonies, suggested a deliberate choreography. Herbs measured not by recipe but by intention, stirring time to songs or syllables, bowls aligned in symbolic patterns. Each action, when interpreted through the lens of Creole or African ceremonial practices, could transform ordinary ingredients into conduits of influence, acting upon both the human psyche and perhaps on forces beyond empirical understanding. Anthropologists examining these accounts note that the cultural logic embedded in such rituals may intersect with psychological expectation, creating a feedback loop. The performer influences the participants, whose reactions then validate and reinforce the ritual's perceived power. In this sense, the supper becomes simultaneously human and supernatural, mundane and transcendent. The persistence of ambiguity ensures that no narrative can claim finality. Science confirms facts but not intent. Spirituality interprets meaning but cannot establish causality. Psychology offers frameworks but leaves gaps where material evidence and folklore intersect. The town's cultural memory, the retelling of Lisette's actions, the scent of herbs in the evening air, the lingering impression of calm and judgment, preserves the tension between these interpretations. Each analysis, each test, each retelling contributes to a story layered in complexity, where the boundary between the known and the unknown, the measurable and the ineffable, is perpetually porous. Lisette's legacy embodies this interplay. Was she a masterful manipulator of human perception, a practitioner of ancestral ritual, or an unintentional agent in a cascade of psychosomatic events? The evidence points in multiple directions simultaneously, Every artifact examined scientifically becomes a spiritual talisman. Every ritual account demands forensic scrutiny. The cultural memory of New Orleans, inscribed through oral history, diaries, and scholarly inquiry, keeps the story alive precisely because neither science nor superstition can claim supremacy. Scholars, both secular and religious, agree on one point. The Delacroix Mansion incident challenges the limits of human understanding, forcing observers to confront the interplay of chemical, psychological, and metaphysical forces. Ultimately, the fatal supper, analyzed through decades of science and superstition, remains a locus of tension. It defies reductionist explanation, resisting categorization as either a natural or supernatural event. The intersection of reason and faith, empirical observation and ritualistic practice, establishes the supper as a case study in the limitations of human knowledge. For every chemical compound identified, every folkloric parallel drawn, every psychological framework proposed, the mystery persists, growing richer with interpretation yet retaining an unassailable core of uncertainty. The story of Lisette, her herbs, and the midnight soup transcends simple categorization, occupying a liminal space where science meets belief and fact merges seamlessly with legend. The Delacroix Mansion's collapse into ruin did not mark the end of its influence. Rather, it catalyzed a haunting imprint upon the surrounding peripheries of New Orleans, a resonance that extended far beyond physical decay. Locals began to speak in hushed tones of shadowy figures glimpsed along the moss-laden bayou, of silhouettes that lingered at the periphery of fog-laden streets, vanishing as soon as attention focused upon them. The earliest accounts, preserved in fragile diaries and letters now housed in the city archives, recount a recurring phenomenon: the scent of herbs, salt and decay that would appear abruptly on humid nights, wafting through houses long after the mansion had burned, as though the memory of Lisette's midnight soup had been distilled into the very air. Scholars later hypothesized that the persistence of these scents could be attributed to environmental factors, such as decomposing organic matter or volatile compounds released from marshlands. Yet, the alignment of these occurrences with anniversaries or stormy nights resisted simple explanation. Residents told stories of fleeting glimpses of figures walking barefoot along the bayou bank, small, precise movements that could have belonged to a child, but with the authority and rhythm of someone who had witnessed centuries of hidden cruelty. Churches, once vibrant centers of community gathering, noted a precipitous decline in attendance. Priests recorded in pastoral logs that parishioners seemed distracted, fearful, or preoccupied, as if an invisible weight pressed upon their consciences. Families who had lived in the vicinity for generations began to move away, seeking distance from an environment saturated with memories too potent to ignore. Some households vanished without explanation, leaving furniture and personal items in disarray, a subtle echo of the sudden stillness that had claimed the Delacroix family. Oral histories, painstakingly collected by folklorists in the 20th century, revealed consistent motifs: the smell of soup on the air, the sight of dancing candlelight behind collapsed windows, the sensation of being watched in moments of private reflection. Children grew up with warnings that blended moral instruction with practical terror. Mind your manners, or the soup will find you. The legend evolved into a tool for social cohesion, instilling both obedience and awe, even as its details blurred with each retelling. Psychologists examining these accounts propose that the town internalized the trauma collectively, transforming individual fear into a shared cognitive landscape. The empty halls of the Delacroix Mansion became repositories of projected anxiety. The bayou mist acted as a canvas upon which collective guilt, unspoken sins, and intergenerational tension were inscribed. This process of cultural projection may explain the ubiquity of sensory experiences associated with the mansion: the smells, the shadows, the fleeting impressions of movement. Memory here functions almost as a sentient entity, shaping perception and guiding interpretation of ambiguous stimuli. A resident might glimpse a branch swaying in the wind, yet perceive a figure. The faintest hint of herbal aroma could trigger associations with the fatal supper. The persistence of these phenomena illustrates the power of expectation, imagination, and narrative in structuring lived experience. Yet contrasts emerge sharply between rational skepticism and lived experience. Journalistic accounts from the early 20th century, seeking to catalog and explain local superstition, often dismissed reports as exaggeration or mass hysteria. Researchers measuring humidity, wind patterns, and soil compositions sought natural explanations for the apparitions and scents. Still, Such analyses could not fully account for the timing, precision, and psychological intensity of the observations. Oral history suggests that the mansion's influence extended into subconscious behavior. Children hesitated to play near the bayou. Adults reported fleeting anxieties in otherwise ordinary tasks, and entire families reoriented their daily lives around unseen patterns of frisk and avoidance. The mansion, though physically decayed, had imprinted itself onto the cognitive and emotional geography of the community. In this sense, the Delacroix incident transcended history, functioning simultaneously as folklore, warning, and moral mirror. The mansion's decay did not diminish the story's potency, rather it amplified them. Scholars documenting the oral histories noted an intriguing phenomenon. The more dilapidated and overgrown the mansion became, the more vivid the stories of its haunting were recounted. Windows broken by time were transformed in memory into eyes that observed intruders. Moss-covered walls became living tapestries conveying the past's judgment. Visitors from outside the region were often unsettled, describing feelings of unease that seemed disproportionate to the environment's material decay. Anthropologists interpreted this as evidence of cultural memory exerting real psychological force, demonstrating how collective belief can shape perception in tangible ways. Religious interpretations continued alongside psychological and folkloric analyses. Clergy often framed the events as moral cautionary tales, emphasizing divine attention to human behavior. Sermons warned that pride, cruelty, and indifference could ripple through generations, leaving behind invisible scars in communities and landscapes alike. The recurrence of sensory phenomena, smells, shadows, fleeting figures, was interpreted as evidence of persistent spiritual presence, of moral truth encoded into place. Here, contrast is again salient. Secular observers focused on environmental causation, while spiritual interpreters emphasized ethical causality, creating a dialogue in which both readings coexisted without resolving the underlying enigma. The bayou itself, with its dense vegetation, shifting water levels, and reflective pools, contributed to the mansion's haunting presence. Natural sounds, frogs wind through cypress branches, distant all calls, became interwoven with human perception, amplifying fear and reinforcing narrative expectation. Townspeople reported that during particularly stormy nights, the air would thicken with an aromatic blend of herbs, salt, and something faintly metallic, a combination matching historical descriptions of Lisette's midnight soup. Skeptical observers suggest these phenomena could arise from chemical emissions from decomposing organic material or ozone effects during storms. Yet the alignment with anniversaries and cultural memory implies a non-random pattern. Children internalized these experiences, translating them into moral cautionary tales that reinforced societal norms while embedding fear. Games, songs, and nursery rhymes referenced the midnight soup, teaching attentiveness, respect for elders, and obedience. Yet the lessons were inseparable from horror. The narrative warned that even the innocuous could conceal fatal consequences. Over generations, Thestry evolved into a living myth, continually reinforced by observation, cultural practice, and shared memory. Contrasts continue to structure interpretation. Rational skepticism offers plausible explanations, yet lived experience conveys emotional truth. The mansion's shadow persisted, tangible in its effects if not in measurable form. Scientific analysis catalogs residues and environmental data, but cannot capture the sense of moral reckoning that residents report. Spiritual readings validate the presence of intention, ritual, and ancestral judgment, but cannot provide empirical confirmation. Psychological frameworks illuminate mechanisms for projection, hallucination, and collective memory, but cannot account for every sensory alignment, the repeated coincidence of events, or the intensity of belief transmitted across generations. In these contradictions lies Thestry's endurance. Each interpretation illuminates part of the event while leaving gaps, creating a tension that ensures continual engagement and debate. The town's memory is thus both literal and metaphorical, a sediment of perception, morality, and narrative layered across landscape, community, and mind. It demonstrates how a singular catastrophic event can reshape cultural consciousness, producing persistent effects that defy resolution. The mansion, though crumbled and overgrown, continues to exert influence through stories, perception, and memory, ensuring that the midnight soup, Lisette, and the moral weight of the family's demise remain alive in collective imagination. By the 20th century, the mansion's story had become codified in local lore, but it remained unresolved. No conclusive evidence explained the deaths, the smells, or the apparitions. Each retelling strengthened the sense of sentience in the town's memory, creating a feedback loop in which expectation, observation, and narrative reinforced one another. Scholars, folklorists, psychologists, and clergy all contributed to the tapestry of explanation, but the event's true cause remained tantalizingly elusive. The town itself, through memory and collective experience, preserved both mystery and morality, allowing the story to function simultaneously as warning, legend, and psychological landscape. Even today, when mist rolls across the bayou and humidity drapes over the decaying remnants of the mansion, visitors and locals alike report sensations that align with centuries-old accounts: sudden chills, fleeting aromas, and glimpses of figures at the periphery of vision. These occurrences, whether interpreted as natural phenomena, hallucination, or spiritual residue, confirm the Delacroix Mansion's ongoing role as a site where history, psychology, and folklore converge. The town's memory has become a living presence, as persistent as the moss on cypress trunks, as intangible yet real as the fear and fascination it continues to evoke. Long after the Delacroix Mansion had fallen into ruin, scholars, folklorists, psychologists, and curious observers continued to return to the story of Lisette and her infamous midnight soup. Debate remains unresolved. Was Lisette a calculated murderer, a victim of circumstance, or a conduit for ancestral or spiritual justice? Each interpretation reflects the lens through which the observer engages the past, revealing as much about the interpreter as the events themselves. Legal historians suggest that the lack of criminal proceedings, the absence of evidence, and the sudden vanishing of Lisette point to a deliberate orchestration, an act of human agency, executed with meticulous precision. Yet cultural historians emphasize that the story cannot be divorced from its context. Creole society in postbellum New Orleans was layered with hierarchies of race, class, and superstition, where culinary rituals often carried symbolic, moral, or spiritual weight. Food in this context was never merely sustenance. It was an instrument of power, an intimate medium through which authority, devotion, and vengeance could be enacted. The soup, meticulously prepared and carefully served, functions as a focal point for these intersecting layers of meaning. Anthropologists tracing the story through oral histories and archival material observe the persistent presence of ritualized practices in Lisette's reported actions. Her methodical stirring, the timing of the meal, the selection of herbs and spices, and the order in which dishes were served all suggest adherence to a pattern recognizable in West African spiritual traditions, including those preserved and adapted by Creole communities in Louisiana. In such traditions, food often serves as a symbolic conduit for ancestral presence or spiritual justice. To share a meal is to acknowledge a bond. To consume it is to internalize responsibility, and to prepare it with care can invoke protective or punitive power. From this perspective, Lisette may not have acted solely as an agent of vengeance. She could have functioned as a vessel through which a broader, moral or spiritual order enacted itself. This interpretation reframes the event not merely as a crime or tragedy, but as a cultural act encoded with ethical and spiritual significance. Digital and forensic studies of surviving artifacts further complicate interpretation. Kitchen utensils recovered from the Delacroix estate, analyzed with modern imaging techniques, reveal wear patterns and residues suggesting ritualistic precision. Bowls, ladles, and stirring implements bear marks of repeated use in highly controlled sequences. Micro-residues of herbs and salts align with botanical profiles historically associated with both culinary and ceremonial functions. Scholars caution against oversimplifying these findings as proof of guilt or supernatural influence, emphasizing instead that they demonstrate intentionality, pattern, and care, qualities that can be interpreted either as meticulous criminal planning or as adherence to ritual convention. Furthermore, reports from urban explorers, historians, and locals note that on humid, storm-laden nights, faint aromas reminiscent of Lisette's ingredients seem to persist around the ruins. These recurring sensory phenomena, if not hallucination or environmental artifact, imply that the material world, memory, and narrative have intertwined, creating a lingering presence that defies purely rational analysis. Psychologists and cultural theorists expand on this idea, considering the midnight soup as a catalyst for moral and collective reflection. The Delacroix family, according to surviving accounts, represented a lineage of authority, refinement, and cruelty, a social microcosm reflecting broader hierarchies of power, wealth, and moral oversight in the region. Lisette, in this framing, becomes both a participant and a mirror. The act of preparing and serving the soup may be understood as an externalization of suppressed grievances, a psychosocial punctuation of injustice. Scholars applying theories of mass psychology, trauma, and intergenerational memory suggest that the event's resonance derives not only from the physical deaths themselves, but from the ethical and emotional consequences embedded in the narrative. The continued fascination with Lisette, the mansion, and the midnight soup reveals the ways in which moral crises and ambiguous acts of justice persist in collective consciousness, reappearing in subsequent retellings as cautionary allegory or unresolved enigma. Folklorists and literary historians emphasize that the legend evolves with each generation. Early 20th century retellings focused on Lisette as a silent avenger. Children's cautionary tales dramatized the potential for unseen consequences when moral proprieties are violated. By the mid-20th century, accounts began to incorporate elements of supernatural horror. Ghostly apparitions in the mansion, floating candlelight, and the recurring scent of herbs and salt. Oral histories, theater productions, and local radio dramatizations each added layers to the story, reflecting contemporary anxieties about morality, power, and vengeance. Anthropologists note that such evolution is characteristic of enduring folklore. The narrative adapts to each cultural context, absorbing new fears and values while retaining its core structural elements. In Lisette's case, the story functions as both entertainment and moral guidepost, instructing listeners in the consequences of cruelty, negligence, or imbalance in social and familial relations. Religious interpretations continue to coexist with secular and folkloric readings. Clergy, inspired by both Catholic and Creole spiritual frameworks, have suggested that Lisette's act may be viewed as a form of divine mediation, wherein justice, normally inaccessible through human institutions, was enacted through ritualized consumption. The act of preparing and sharing food becomes a site of moral arbitration, an intimate and unavoidable interaction with ethical consequence. This interpretation, while deeply embedded in faith, resonates with broader cultural understandings. The narrative preserves an ethical framework in which acts of inattention, cruelty, or corruption generate consequences that reverberate beyond the immediate actors. Modern technology adds yet another layer of intrigue. Digital scans of surviving kitchenware and manuscripts reveal anomalies. Letters on remnants of recipe pages appear to shift subtly when viewed under different lighting or imaging techniques. While some experts attribute these observations to optical artifacts or software algorithms, others suggest a more poetic interpretation, that thestry, like the soup itself, retains agency, continuously rewriting itself in the memory of those who observe it. The narrative, then, is not static. It evolves, adapts, and endures, maintaining a liminal space between history, memory, and interpretation. Lisette's legacy is ultimately multifaceted: moral, cultural, psychological, and symbolic. The midnight soup resonates as an emblem of human complexity, moral ambiguity, and the interplay between individual action and collective consciousness. It challenges observers to consider questions of intent, justice, and consequence. Was Lisette a calculated agent of death, a surrogate for ancestral or spiritual judgment, or a victim of her circumstances who became mythologized in the retelling? Each interpretation illuminates part of the phenomenon while leaving gaps that invite continued investigation, debate, and imagination. The legend continues to inspire scholarly research, artistic creation, and popular fascination, suggesting that its enduring power lies not in resolution, but in ambiguity. The story of Lisette and the midnight soup demonstrates the ways in which narrative, ritual, and memory can extend beyond the lifespan of individuals, permeating culture, consciousness, and space. It is an ethical, psychological, and aesthetic artifact, reflecting the values, fears, and obsessions of a community over time. Whether approached through science, folklore, psychology, or spiritual belief, the tale's resonance lies in its resistance to closure. Each retelling renews the mystery, ensuring that Lisette's presence, if only as a conceptual force, remains alive. Ultimately, the legacy of the midnight soup is both tangible and intangible, material and immaterial, human and mythic. It persists in the sense carried on stormy nights, the patterns etched into surviving utensils, and the cultural memory embedded in New Orleans' collective consciousness. The story's endurance underscores the complexity of interpreting events at the intersection of morality, trauma, and ritual, reminding observers that some acts cannot be fully explained, only experienced, remembered, and reflected upon. Lisette's hand, once literal, now echoes across generations, leaving an indelible mark on the landscape of memory itself. The Delacroix mansion no longer casts its shadow over the outskirts of New Orleans. Its walls have crumbled, consumed by vines and rot, leaving nothing but a footprint in the soil and a memory in the minds of those who dare to remember. Yet the story of Lisette and the midnight soup persists, woven into the fabric of local folklore, whispered in the humid air, and carried by generations of storytellers who cannot resist recounting the night that silenced an entire lineage. Every retelling adds a layer, a subtle variation, yet the core remains unchanged: a young cook, a ritualized meal, and a house that witnessed both care and death. Scholars continue to debate her intentions. Was she an agent of vengeance, a conduit for ancestral justice, or a young girl forced into circumstances beyond comprehension? Each theory reflects the observer as much as the event itself, revealing human desires to explain the inexplicable, to categorize morality, and to impose narrative on chaos. Locals speak of the mansion as if it still exists, not in bricks and mortar, but in atmosphere, in scent, and in sensation. On stormy nights, the faint aroma of herbs and salt drifts over the bayou, teasing the edges of memory. Some claim they hear lullabies faintly carried on the wind, melodic, sorrowful, and just beyond comprehension. Children warn each other to never wander too close to the remnants of the estate, their tales laced with fear, reverence, and awe. Psychologists might call it collective memory, a projection of guilt, or intergenerational trauma. Spiritualists call it the lingering hand of forces unseen. Each explanation is partial, yet none can diminish the sense of presence. The feeling that the night, the soup, and Lisette herself remain active participants in the narrative refusing closure. Cultural observers highlight the soup's symbolic resonance. It transcends its ingredients, becoming an artifact of moral and psychological consequence. To consume a meal is to internalize it, and to prepare a meal is to assert control, influence, or ritualized power. Lisette's midnight soup is remembered not because of flavor or sustenance, but because of what it represented: the intersection of innocence and cruelty, obedience and rebellion, human and possibly supernatural design. Urban explorers and historians report anomalies, shifting shadows, fleeting scents, whispers of movement where no one stands. These sensations blur the line between tangible evidence and the imagination's reach, ensuring that the mansion, though gone, refuses to be forgotten. Perhaps the midnight soup was never intended to feed the body. Perhaps it was meant to feed memory, guilt, fascination, and fear. It lingers in the imagination like a ghost, teaching that some stories, some acts, and some nights resist finality. Lisette's hand, once literal, now stretches across time and consciousness, imprinting her story onto the world itself. Scholars, storytellers, and locals alike carry fragments of her presence: ethical puzzles, whispered fears, and the haunting aroma of a meal that refused to end. In this sense, the legend endures not as history alone, but as experience, echoing in every shadow, every sigh of wind, and every storm-laden night when the bayou reminds us that some stories never truly end.